helps you stay acutely attuned to what's happening rather than getting caught up in all the, again, it's this part of our brain that can like predict into the future, remember into the past. Which again can be really helpful if we're using it skillfully, but not necessarily helpful sometimes in the moment. So yeah, I would say that's kind of how it gets applied to sports, and there's a lot of work that's been done there.
What do you say to people who struggle with guilt over things that they missed? Because it sounds like there's a thematic element here where somebody does something wrong, whether they ground out to second base or drop a pass or miss a deadline or just don't give their all on a project and it doesn't work out, all the way up to, intense family guilt. And I talk a lot about the shame guilt treadmill that families and religions can put on us, where there's this like, if you don't do this, then you won't be in our good graces. And there's a biological survival instinct to that too, because we don't want to get kicked out of our tribes and so forth. But when the target is moving and reconciliation is not allowed and forgiveness is not granted, how do you get people out of that stuck in guilt in a dead moment of the past type of mentality?
Yeah, so there's two concepts that I'll talk about with that. One comes really deeply rooted in Buddhist philosophy, which has a lot to do with the idea of causes and conditions. And I found this to be so valuable, like right now in the pandemic, in the environmental, political situation, you can really see this playing out, these ideas of, and how this relates to mindfulness is that a big part of what we do as we develop a mindfulness practice, and this is one of the really significant underpinnings of practice, is you start to become aware of the impermanent, transient nature of things.
Yes.
And I think it's sometimes, and I think this has changed a lot here in the United States, where we're a country that's been well developed, has had a lot of wealth, has had a lot of systems that tend to work really well. And so when you live in an environment like that, there can be this misperception about reality, that you have way more control over things than you actually do. If you really notice anything in the world, it's impermanent and changing. It's not reliable, which can be ungrounding. So remind me to come back to that if I forget. Yeah. But that's important, because what we start to know, if you can really see the truth in that, is that, my mind states are not reliable. They're also impermanent and changing.
Ooh, yeah.
And that the things where I get stuck on, while I think I might be this kind of person, if I really notice what's happening, that's not always true. That's not true in every situation. So we start to notice like things aren't as solid as they seem. And I think that's really useful, because when we think things are solid or fixed, then we can develop this whole relationship to them that maybe isn't always that useful, because the conditions will never be fixed. And I think so. Then enter coronavirus into the US. All of a sudden, all of those systems that seem so reliable, so dependable, that people are attached to, they're not like that. It's like the causes and conditions created that. And some of those causes and conditions have created a lot of harm over time. And so you're seeing that come up in the political situation, which isn't just about right now. It's about hundreds of years of what has established and created that. Same with the environment, right? We're experiencing like the fires over the last few years, especially in the western part of the United States. And I know across the globe in different areas, it's like this is all from prior causes and conditions. So that doesn't absolve us from responsibility. That it actually, in some ways, informs responsibility. Like whatever decisions I make now will generationally impact others. So it's really critical that we know something about our intention, like you said, and how that informs what comes next. So then there's this other whole concept about actions and intentions. If we know that conditionality is true, our actions and our intentions really matter. And so and what I love about mindfulness, I think a lot of people, when they think about meditators, is like, oh, people are just like off isolating themselves, not talking, trying to check out of reality. That is not at all what we're doing. It's like, no, I'm going to show up to my mind and I'm going to show up to my body, even when it's hard, to know how I can learn to be in relationship with that, not check out of it, but actually learn to be in relationship with that, because I know it's impermanent, because I know it's changing. And then we have more and more ability to see things clearly as they are. And the more clearly we can see things without filters, without judgments, without all those lenses we might have, then we actually can start to make skillful actions and choices. And those impact, again, conditionality in the future. But I mean, I know this started with a question about guilt. It's like, on the one hand, if you think about all of the things that informed your personality, everything it took for you to be who you are today, you probably you had control over some of that, and some of that you did not have control over, right? So it's like, and just like coronavirus, I think for so many people, like one of the things I've been hearing a lot is, like, I just can't do everything. I'm not showing up the way that I used to be able to. I'm disappointed in myself. I'm frustrated. I can't seem to stay on top of things. And it's like, of course you can't. The whole game changed. The conditions are not the same. There's no way in these new conditions you could have the same expectations of yourself. But you could see where our fixed mindset kind of keeps us stuck there. So I think in those ways, if we can start to see that things are malleable, because guilt seems to come from a place of, at least, and you could probably shed more light on this, but when I think about the concept of guilt, it feels like something unfixable. And if you really believe in impermanence and you can really see the truth of that, then nothing's unfixable. We might not be able to change actions in the past. And that's why actions are like having good moral actions. And you can see that at the base of every contemplative tradition, that concept of morality, hugely important, because that is like sets the bar. And then if we're taking, the actions that we think are the most skillful in the moment, there's not that much room for guilt. It's like, well, I showed up, I responded, I tried to relate to that, I apologized, when there was, some intent that some impact from an intent that I didn't mean. So,
right.
Yeah, it doesn't absolve people, I guess, of their past actions, but it certainly gives us a way to acknowledge them and try to have more skillful actions moving forward, and just to recognize, like, we're also not in charge of all of it.
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long tangent.
No, it was really good. And you brought up a couple of really good points there. One is, you asked about guilt. So as I understand it from Carol Izard's work, and Carol Izard is a guy who I've referenced many, many times before, and he really made some groundbreaking discoveries with regard to our adaptive function of emotional purpose. And so what does that mean? Well, how do our emotions tell us how to adapt to the environment is really what it means. And so the functions of shame and guilt, which are two of our 10 discrete emotions, as he calls them, is shame tells us that we fail to meet somebody else's expectations, meaning we cause pain. So we cause sadness in someone else, which is another one of our 10. And then guilt says, go fix it. And that's it. It's very, very neutral. And pop psychology has taken those and applied different definitions, and they're not necessarily wrong. But the idea is that if you have made the effort to repair whatever is broken, that you broke, you failed to meet somebody's standards, that's all you can do. And if they continue to put you on the shame guilt treadmill by saying, well, sorry, that was a nice try, but not good enough, then you get the opportunity to say, I did what I could, which is what I hear you saying. It's like, it's impermanent. I can't change it now. I got to let it go. And if the other person doesn't want to let it go, it's on them. It's not on me, because I can't control that, which is very important component to finding peace, I think, in one's life. And then the other couple of concepts there are the idea that, and Sam Harris talks about this. I don't know if you know who Sam Harris is, but he talks about, he's got an app, actually. It's called Wake Up or Awake or something like that. It's a mindfulness app. And he says, if you're doing the app and you're not applying that insight, that awareness to life, is pretty much worthless. So we have to do something with our level of mindfulness. We can't just like be mindful and then go back to living life the way that we were. That defeats the purpose. And then Christian Conti, who's a friend of mine, he's been on the show a couple times. He talks about the impermanence. He's also, practices Buddhism and the idea that all things are temporary. And I wanted to tie you back to this because you said it can be very ungrounding. And I think that's a really good point. When we bring that up, it's not to provoke anxiety and say that, oh my gosh, like even my life is impermanent. Well, yes, it is. So then we get a little bit existential here and we say, now that you have boundaries or parameters on your life, it's like being granted a whiteboard, or a surface or some piece of thing to sculpt. Make with this what I give you, rather than having this idea that we've got forever or the canvas is never ending. You have to create within the parameters, and within the parameters of life, life is temporary. So let's create as much as we can, and also be mindful of the ripple effect that whatever we do is going to touch people from many generations from here on out in ways that we'll never probably see most of the time. And all that is about being mindful of one's actions in the moment. If I spastically yell at my children, that's not a mindful activity. It may be limbic. It may be a response to environment and my inability to be aware and control my own frustrations. But the impact upon them may totally be unintentional. And if I do that enough, maybe they end up being scared of me or they don't trust me or something like that. And we go back to the shame and guilt. If I yell at my kids and they burst into tears, I'd better go make an apology if I want to be right with them and then have some credibility later on. Otherwise, I'm just going to be viewed as a yelling, screaming, tyrannical dad. So we want to do things with great intention. And typically, when we do things with great intention and good mindfulness, we end up making choices that do benefit more than they cause detriment. Because it's often said that if you act out of emotion, that's when you do things you regret. So that's just kind of my encapsulation of that. But I do want to invite you back to talk about the ungroundingness, because I know what I just said out of my mouth and give my opinion. But what does it mean to be to flirt with the potential floating in perpetuity, like postmodernism says, well, everything's a construct of a construct and nothing is real and you can just make it up as you go, and that seems pretty dangerous to me, if you're not grounded in anything. So how do people find their grounding, I guess, so that they can be mindful, they can be non-attached, they can acknowledge the impermanence of things, but yet still return to values, beliefs, whatever?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And I like subtleties, so it's a little bit of a subtlety. Sometimes in Buddhist philosophy, we talk about near and far enemies. And I think that's a helpful way to look at things. So I'll bring forward this word equanimity. And the idea of equanimity is finding some balance. And that feels like just the right thing. When I talk about impermanence, like that's something that's true. And it's also true that I'm here, right? So I'm not divorcing myself from the human experience, because also in Buddhist philosophy, there's this concept of no self. And people are like, well, what does that even mean? And I think it's more the way that it's presented. It's really this idea of self in process. So that's the way I like to think of it. It's like this self that exists and it's changing along the way. So this quality of equanimity, I think, can be like a grounding and a balancing factor. So we both know that things are impermanent and changing, and we're in relationship to how they are in the moment. So I think that's really important. I think, well, I'm just going to pause. Be mindful for a moment. There's so much here. So the near enemy of equanimity is indifference. So there is not, and I bring that up because you asked about being attached. So it's like, okay, well, if everything's impermanent and changing, why get attached to anything anyways?
That's nihilism. That's nihilism, right?
Yeah. And that's not at all what this practice is about. And I think for me, I had to really do my own soul searching about that. And I think what I came up with is, if I knew everything was going to last forever, it wouldn't be precious in the way that it is.
Good point.
Now. And that really helped me. It was like, oh, kind of like what you were saying about your life. Like, yeah. So it's impermanent, it's changing. So rather than disengaging or having that, that near enemy of indifference, it's like, no, I want to engage.